Practice session.
The early interventions program. It's reflected in our development and expansion of what Terri will be speaking about, doing DPAs in the domestic violence context, which again, almost no other office in the country is doing that.
No,
So,
and this is, save this. This is all great stuff.
Yeah.
Don't blow the David Gilmour-esque guitar solo in the beginning of the concert. Build it up. Comfortably Numb comes on and you go. Dr. Strodthoff, it's good to see you.
Thanks, Amelia. You can just call me Terri.
I will. I'm going to introduce you all formally to begin with, and then I'll call you by first names. Shannon, it's good to see you too. Sean, it's always good to see you, even if it's a frozen image. We're going to switch over to the large webinar now. We've got a minute or so, and we'll wait, and then I'll do some introductions. I generally give 5 minutes to begin practices. So good morning. You got a minute or two to load up with water and coffee.
Water, I ain't got no water.
Mike, Terri, John, how's it going?
How are you,
Hey, Sean, how are you?
Good.
Good. Donnetta, I don't think we ever met, but it's good to meet you virtually.
You too. Thank you, sir.
And we just went live. We have the first 30 of the 170 who've registered for the webinar joining us. And as I was mentioning earlier, last week we had 140 people in the webinar and another 500 or so watching on Facebook in the first couple of hours. So this will be great. Something similar. Welcome, friends who are just signing in. We're going to give it a couple of minutes for people to join us. It's not quite noon. And I promise I've learned from mistakes. Last week, I will switch to speaker view instead of gallery view for the duration of the presentation. And we invite you to ask questions, of course, in the chat function. We'll be curating those and sharing those.
Shannon, what up?
What's going on, Sean?
Free people problems.
Yeah, pray for you. Gotta get you one of those vignettes.
Friends who are just joining us, give us a few minutes. Folks are still signing in. We will be simulcasting this on Facebook as well. You're welcome to ask any questions you want in the chat or on Facebook. We'll have other people moderating it. Welcome, friends who are just joining us for the second of our 2 webinars from the committee, the Milwaukee Turners Committee on Confronting Mass Incarceration. We're going to begin in just a couple of minutes. This is the face I make while I'm simulcasting our broadcast on Facebook and making sure that that's working out. Okay, for those of us just joining, we're going to start in about a minute and a half. And we thank you for joining us for the second of our webinars on criminal legal systems and violence. Today's webinar is entitled Radical Questions, Diversion, and Reentry Circles. Okay, Professor Mike, does it look good? Should I start it?
I think so, yeah. The room is filling up, so I think so.
Okay, great. So, all right, a warm Milwaukee Turner welcome, friends. My name is Emilio Dottore. I am the Executive Director of the Milwaukee Turners. And on behalf of Jalili Kohler, head of our Confronting Mass Incarceration Committee, and the Milwaukee Turners, now numbering close to 300 members, we welcome you to Criminal Legal Systems and Violence, Restorative Justice, and Circle Keeping as a Road to Repair. This is the second of 4 webinars examining this topic, and today's title is Radical Questions, Diversion, and Reentry Circles. And I'm very excited for the speakers and panelists who are with us today. Before I introduce them and before we hear all that they have to offer on this, I'd like to thank and welcome our partners, the Wisconsin Decarceration Platform, the Wisconsin Justice Initiative, the Milwaukee School of Engineering, Community Advocates Public Policy Institute, UWM Institute for Systems Change and Peacebuilding, the Restorative Circles LLC, Project Return, Marquette University, Center for Urban Research, Teaching and Outreach, MATC, Milwaukee Mental Health Task Force, the ACLU of Wisconsin, the City of Milwaukee Office of Violence Prevention, the Community Warehouse, National Lawyers Guild Milwaukee Chapter, the Alma Center, Wisconsin Department of Corrections, and of course, Boswell Books. As I mentioned last week, there is an epidemic of violence in our culture. And after many years of exploring this issue, the Milwaukee Turners would like to present how restorative justice and circle keeping may provide an essential part of the solution to repairing this. We all know that violence is everywhere. It's in the courts, it's throughout the criminal legal system, it's in reentry, diversion, and of course in the community itself. We're brought up on violence. Many of us crave violence in entertainment, and we seem to accept and encourage violence from the playground all the way to the presidency. And so today, from now until 2 p.m., we're going to explore radical questions, diversion, and reentry circles, pardon me. Today's speaker, who will be jumping on a little while, will be Speaker Danielle Sered, founder and director of Common Justice and former program director of the Vera Institute. And she'll discuss solutions to violence that can help transform the lives of those harmed and foster racial equality. She also authored the book Until We Reckon, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and the Road to Repair. And I encourage you to go to Boswell Books at boswellbooks.com to order your copy today. We'll post a link to that in the chat, as well as many of the other things you'll be hearing. Our distinguished speakers and panelists will discuss existing and possible alternatives in Wisconsin. And with us today, we have District Attorney of Milwaukee County, John Chisholm. We have Donnetta Foxx, Dane County Community Restorative Court Program Leader. We have Dr. Terri Strodthoff, founder and director of the Alma Center. We have Shannon Ross, the Executive Director of the Community and a Reentry Fellow Masters of Sustainable Peacebuilding, UWM. We have my dear friend Sean Wilson, Campaign for Smart Justice Manager at the ACLU of Wisconsin. With me is my co-moderator, Associate Professor Mike Carrier from the Milwaukee School of Engineers. And again, I'm Emilio Dottore from the Milwaukee Turners. Please ask any questions in the chat or on Facebook, where they are being curated by our friends, Tamika Vukovic, Molly Collins, Chrissy Fung, and Mike Carrier. So, it's my pleasure now to invite District Attorney John Chisholm to begin talking a little about some of the programs that he has helped lead and charge here in Milwaukee. DA Chisholm has been Milwaukee's district attorney since 2007. A graduate of Marquette University, John is also a veteran of the United States Army and received his law degree from the University of Wisconsin Law School. He worked as a prosecutor under DA Michael McCann and currently has one of the few restorative justice programs in the state of Wisconsin. Welcome and thank you, DA Chisholm.
Well, thank you very much, Emilio, and it's great to be able to share some space with these wonderful, talented speakers as well. And Yeah, you start at a really good place. I was first introduced to the concept of restorative justice actually probably around 1995. And the person who introduced it to me was actually sharing courtroom space with me. I was actually assigned to one of our few dedicated domestic violence courts at the time. And one of the more senior assistant DAs was David Lerman. And so he was actually spending part of his day working with me in the courtroom. And then the other part of his day, he was working on developing a restorative justice program. And I just remember, I'll be honest, when he was telling me about it, I was like, that doesn't sound like something a DA should be doing. That sounds like kind of something a social worker should be doing, or somebody else. And but it was the start of a process that introduced me to very different ways of thinking, because even in that context, back in that day, you would walk into court with 120, 150 files, and you would have police officers, victims, defendants, just all the attorneys all crammed into court, and you would be piling through cases, and the opportunity to actually sit down and have a meaningful interaction with the victim, sit down and actually discuss the issue with the defense attorney, get some insight from law enforcement. It was just so limited. And what David was pointing out to me at the time is that his approach was going to be the exact opposite. He wanted to create a space where the victim would be able to have a meaningful interaction with the person that had harmed them, and that the calculations would be different. They wouldn't be how much time you're going to get in jail, all of those issues. It was going to be a recognition that you harmed somebody, that you were going to accept responsibility for that, and that you were going to do something to try to repair that harm. So that's planted the seed in my head. In about year 2000, we actually started expanding that program and directing people, primarily in misdemeanor cases, to have an opportunity to engage in the restorative process. So we're now on our 20th anniversary of a formal restorative justice program. David approached me when I was running for office and asked if I would be committed to maintaining and potentially expanding that process. And one of the next areas that we went into was actually in children's court, and develop policies that would allow youth to have meaningful restorative interactions with the victims there as well. And but it influenced the development of what is now known as our early interventions program. So starting in 2007, looking at some of the data, by the way, that data was actually deeply informed by working with the Vera Institute, who came in and examined our office's practices with respect to disparity. And what they discovered was that there was in fact significant disparity in certain predictable areas of prosecution, mainly in areas related to the lower level drug offenses, public order offenses, and things like that. So one of the commitments I had made is to actually work in partnership with other system actors, like, most importantly, the public defender's office, the court system, to dramatically expand pretrial services. At that time, our pretrial services were extremely sparse, to say the least. We talked to the county and were able to expand pretrial services with the infusion of significant resources, with the idea that we would actually start a process of screening why people are coming into our system, and ways that we could actually divert them out of the system at the front end. And when they needed a little bit more intervention, we could do deferred prosecution agreements. We developed a drug treatment court that expanded to a veterans treatment court that is expanding now to a mental health treatment court. In other words, it's just a process of identifying that people come into our system for lots of different reasons, and we have to take different approaches other than simply prosecuting the case. And where I'd finish where we're at right now from the groundwork that David set back in the 1990s is we're one of the few offices in the country that is doing extensive deferred prosecutions now in domestic violence cases. But it's different. It's predicated on the notion that the individual that's engaging in behavior that is causing harm in the family context almost 100% of the time was exposed to that trauma and that violence themselves. And one of our commitments is yes, to meet the needs of the victim and the family through a concentrated application of resources. That's the Sojourner Family Peace Model. But also, and this is actually coming from the advocate community, focusing on the offender as well, with a concept of rehabilitation and making that person healthy so that they can, in fact, re-enter the community, re-enter their family in a healthy way, in a productive way. And to do that, you have to address the issue of trauma and the issue of violence that's impacting on. I know we're going to have a broader discussion about community trauma, but it follows the same pattern, quite frankly. You start with individuals, those individuals influence neighborhoods, those neighborhoods influence the community, and then there's even national historical models that would be influenced by taking the approach of thinking in terms of the principles of restorative practices. Thank you.
And thank you too, D.A. Chisholm. It's now my pleasure to switch over to Donnetta Foxx from Dane County, who's going to talk a little about what they're doing there. Donnetta is, let me get to this real quick. Donnetta is also a native of Milwaukee and has had a long career in nursing and retail as well. She began work for the Department of Corrections in 1993, and she's worked in the adult male max, medium, and minimum institutions. Donnetta started out as a security guard and worked her way up to captain by the time she retired in 2016. She first discovered restorative justice while working for the Department of Corrections. She began volunteering for the Dane County Restorative Court, also known as CRC, and she currently works there where she gets to practice restorative justice on a daily basis. So much so, I understand that restorative justice has become a part of how she lives her life, and she incorporates into all her interactions personally as well as professionally. So Donnetta, it's my pleasure to invite you to share a little about how restorative justice is being implemented where you are in Dane County.
Thank you, Emilio, very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I started, like I said, I was first introduced to RJ in my career of corrections. I had been working there for about 5 years. So in 1998, I was introduced to RJ. I went to a 3-day training and that's when I first discovered what restorative justice was. And it was just mind-changing, mind-blowing for me to walk into a room of 15 people that you've never seen or met before, and then come out at the end of a 3-day like family, like you had community, you felt for these people and they felt for you. And I was amazed, and it stuck with me, but I wondered why we never got the opportunity to use it in corrections. Throughout my career, I kept saying, man, this is what we needed. This is the missing link. But we could never seem to get it off the ground for whatever reason. But I started using bits and pieces of that practice just in my day-to-day interactions with inmates, my staff, and different things like that, and saw a difference in how they related to me and how I related to them, and found out that it was easier to get that cooperation and what you needed from your staff and your inmates there by using that practices. So that's kind of how I started. And then my 2015, just before I decided to retire, I saw a introduction to restorative justice in Madison in Dane County. And I decided to go to an informational meeting and discovered that they were starting a restorative justice court there. And I wanted to volunteer. And so that's how I kind of started getting involved. And here I am 5 years later, I'm still working with them. And now it's my gig that I do. Once I retired, I decided to work for them. And I just love it. And I actually use it in my everyday practices with professionally and personally. It's that just recognizing that someone else is a human being and that they've had trauma and that they've had things in their life that affects how they perform and how they act in day-to-day operations, and getting to that and allowing them to see that you recognize that and that you understand that and see that humanity in them makes a big difference, and it does work. And so in Dane County, we are a 17 to 25-year-old pre-charge diversion program. So we have MOUs with Dane County and that the district attorney, that when young people get misdemeanors, and there are some felonies that get referred to us as well, get into trouble with the law, they can be referred through us through age and criteria of what the crime is that they commit. And so what that means is they obviously come to us as opposed to going to the court system. And we do the same thing, hold them accountable. We look at three things: what happened, who was responsible for what happened, what harm was done, and then how do we correct that harm. We are a victim-based program as well. So we include the victim if they choose to. They can make impact statements. They can actually sit down, like you said, face-to-face and have that conversation with the respondent. We call our clients respondents, and come up with a game plan. First of all, holding them accountable, what you did, why that harm was done, and how the ripple effect of that harm, not just to the victim, but to the community as a whole. And how do we repair that? And then giving supportive care to both the victim and the respondent is what we do. And so as of December of 2020, we just serviced our 1,000th client. And so we're still infants, but we're growing and we're looking to expand. But it's a great program. And like I said, I use it in my everyday life, working with my adult children, my grandchildren. It just, the mindset, the principles, the concept, if you use that and you carry that, it makes all your relationships so much better. And so, yeah, that's where I am with it. Thank you.
Thank you too. And I'm gonna be able to ask the two of you some questions prior to the arrival of Danielle Sered, but we're getting a bunch of questions in the chat as well as on Facebook, as well as to my cell phone. Oddly, people are texting me questions. So the first question is D. Chisholm, John, and Donnetta. What changes have you seen since you first began these programs, either in Milwaukee and Dane County to now? How has the program evolved?
You know, from my perspective, probably the most dramatic change was that when we committed fully as a criminal justice system through the Community Justice Council to establishing what we would call that universal screening model, that in itself had an impact. Believe it or not, that actually decreased the number of people that we were directing towards restorative practices. And one of the reasons that happened is that that we were able to get a public defender and an assessment being done by a pretrial service expert, and we were able oftentimes then to have close contact with the victim and kind of figure things out almost right away, right? Sometimes all the victim really wanted was to be made whole again if it was a property-based crime. And what we found over the first couple of years is that instead of, in the traditional sense, you would have charged the case, you would have waited 2 weeks to get in the court, you would have set it for trial 3 or 4 months down the line, and then maybe 9 months to a year later, the victim would get contacted and told what the disposition of the case was and asked what kind of restitution they wanted. So one of the benefits that we saw early on was that oftentimes all the victim really wanted was to be made whole. But the other benefit of it is that if they chose to, you actually put the power in their hands. If they really wanted to sit down and understand, I think what we've learned is that one of the greatest causes of fear is the sense that when you've been victimized, that somebody actually did it because they were targeting you specifically in some sense. And obviously that happens, you know, particularly in the family context, everyone, that's a dynamic, but for the typical crime victim, they may not know the person that did this to them. And that just creates an enormous amount of fear. And what you find during this process is if they are able to sit in a controlled environment with reassuring rules, ground rules, and they actually get to see the person that in their mind they may have turned into a monster is actually, wait a minute, it's a 17-year-old kid. And they're seeing him as a 17-year-old kid now. And it just changes the dynamic right away. And oftentimes they come away from it just feeling part of that fear goes away. And so that's the challenge ultimately. And from my standpoint, the challenge is that the adversarial system, and that is what we operate in, it in some ways creates barriers to having those discussions, and rightfully so. I'm not, the constitutional protections in place for a person accused of a crime are absolutely essential. The protections for victims are absolutely essential. Part of the problem with that, however, is that it sometimes puts processes in place that makes it really difficult to get to the heart of the problem sometimes. And of course, that's the system that we operate, and it has the tendency to take on sort of a factory outlet approach where you're just pushing things through because you have this huge volume of demand. And the other thing that I've learned over this is that victims come in all different categories, and that what they tell you, and this doesn't affect their credibility, but what they might say to me or one of my victim advocates might not be the same thing that they're saying to their confidential victim advocate. So we take frozen moments in time and we want to assign accountability to it. And so from a prosecutor standpoint, you're just looking at that frozen moment of time. Can I prove it? And how serious is the offense? And where should I go from there? Restorative justice is not about a frozen moment in time. It's looking backwards and trying to figure out what happened in the past that led to this decision making, this behavior. And then it's looking forward. It's saying, what can we do to repair the harm that's occurred here so it doesn't occur again and again. So the challenge that I face is that the harm in the community is on such a monumental scale, and it's occurring every single day. It is just compounding, and then there's so many other factors that play into it. It's not just the interpersonal harm that is occurring, but there's structural and societal harms that have occurred for a very long time that play into that as well. And so trying to break that is again. Sometimes you have to hear it from what you would have thought were the least likely sources, which would be victim advocates. Victim advocates telling you, wait a minute, we need more tools in the toolbox than simply a binary decision of jail, prison, probation. And really it makes it much more complex. My final comment would be that I firmly believe that this is absolutely essential if we're going to move forward and become a healthy and productive community. But the challenge is, and you can read it in Danielle's book, right? She gives a story about how she was actually through restorative intervention able to stop a cycle of violence, and the victim in the community was actually scared of the formal process, because he was basically saying, look, there's, yeah, you've got the one guy in jail, but all of his friends are still out here in the community. And that's what I'm concerned about. And she intervened, and afterwards the victim said, why, how many of people like you are there? And she said, well, like 5. And how many police are there? And this was New York City, so it was like 35,000, right? That's the thing that ultimately I think that we have to face as a community, as a society, as a nation, and that is to do the kind of work that the people that have lived this experience want to be done, means that we have to adequately invest in it. We have to put the resources in there that would allow this kind of work to take place. because in the absence of that, it's the classic question, divert, but divert to what? If you don't have anything to divert to, then we fall back on doing what we are trained and set up to do, and that's to intervene in that frozen moment in time, assign accountability to it, and move forward. So to create a richer response system is going to require investment.
Thank you. Donnetta, is there anything you'd like to add as to how it may have changed since you've been there? And also, I realized I should backstep. One of the most common questions we received last week too, and I'm receiving now, is even if we could just briefly define what restorative justice is in this context. So it's like a defining of terms so that we don't lose some of the many people following us.
Okay, sure. Basically, John said it all already as far as how the changes. I will just add a couple more in that. Two significant changes that I see is, one, we empower the victim to be able to have a process. And again, coming away feeling like they were heard and that their voices mattered. And then the resources, being able to follow up with, okay, what can we give you or help you with to keep you from making the same mistake and doing the same things. Victims or respondents, what do they need to move forward to make them whole again? We see increase in restitution payments in our program. That's a given. We also get more community involvement. We train peacemakers. They go through 16 hours. We get community folks who want to volunteer, and they go through 16 hours of training. And once they have become involved and interact in some of these circles, then again, they see the benefit and how it works. And then they want to tell others. And so we're getting more people in support of the program that want to be a part of it and sees the value in it. And so those are the two biggest changes that I see. Is one, there's more satisfaction for the victim. We have more response for the respondents, and then we have more community support as we move forward. And again, restorative justice is just basically, again, finding out what happened, who was responsible for that, what was the harm that was done, and then how do we repair that harm. And it's also, like I said, victim-based. So the victim has a big part in what do you want? What was the impact on you and your life? And how can we make you whole again? And having the community support that and letting that respondent that know that you're still part of the community. You're still part of this community. We want you here, but we want you to do it in a way that's safe for all of us and that's productive for everyone. And so that's what our motto is repair harm and take care of the community. Thank you.
Thank you both. Also, and I see we've been joined by Ron Johnson that had also previously worked in Dane County in a similar position. Many people are wondering, how do you get restorative justice started in a city or a county to begin with? What are those initial plans? And if either of you could speak to that.
Well, in our case, you had a passionate advocate who was visionary and way ahead of his time, and you wouldn't take no for an answer. That's the other thing about it. You'd think somebody that was committed to restorative justice would be, just sort of easygoing and take what he could get. Not David. David was a passionate and strong advocate, is what he was. He didn't back down. When the traditional prosecutors would kind of mock the concept, he'd push right back but constantly engage and get people to acknowledge the reality of the system that they were operating in, and acknowledge that we could do better. We could approach it in a different way. And so from our perspective, it was really just the passionate advocacy. And then I think it just takes time. So sometimes, and that's true for me. I've had to evolve as a person, as a prosecutor over the course of my career, and just remain open to challenges and thinking about solutions in different ways. It's, you have to just approach it with some humility. But the reality is that we face resistance on expanding early interventions, and now it's just accepted. Now it is just looked on as the way things should be done, and I think that that's what you're doing. So I know it's daunting in terms of what I think the scale of investment should be in community-based alternatives. I think about the work of like Patrick Sharkey, who's looked at the issue of violence in communities, and what he points to is the only thing he can really identify as the most contributing factor to the reduction of violence in communities over a long period of time. Obviously, the last year being a dramatic exception, but when he looks to it, he thinks that a resourced and even minimally resourced but cohesive community entity right at the neighborhood level is probably the biggest factor in reducing violence. And in other words, it's a concept of social cohesion that is really predicated on people in the community taking ownership of the problems. I think his argument would be that you ought to treat them and resource them at least to the same extent as you do police officers and court systems and correction systems, because the long-term benefits are much greater.
Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Donnetta?
No, I think he said it all.
Okay,
Thank you,
excellent. Then it's my pleasure too. We're gonna switch gears for a second. I want to keep encouraging people to ask questions both on Facebook and those that are texting me, as well as in the chat. And I will let you all know again that we are recording the program. We'll share it on YouTube as we did the previous one. We're going to anonymize who's asking the questions, but we will share and publish all the different questions and comments that everyone is asking us, because they're so very important. Last week we received, I believe Mike and I tallied 132 questions from various streams. And so there's a lot to cover. The number one message I got back was that there wasn't enough time. So it's my pleasure now to also bring to the forefront Danielle Sered, who is going to speak about a variety of things. But first, let me give you a little biography. Danielle envisioned, launched, and directed Common Justice. She led the project's efforts. She leads the project's efforts, locally rooted in Brooklyn, but national in scope, to develop and advance practical and groundbreaking solutions to violence that advance racial equity, meet the needs of those harmed, and do not rely on incarceration. Before planning the launch of Common Justice, Danielle served as the Deputy Director of the Vera Institute Adolescent Reentry Initiative, which is a program for young men returning from incarceration on Rikers Island. Danielle sits on the Downstate Coalition for Crime Victims, the Advisory Council to the New York State Office of Victim Services, the Diversity Advisory Committee to the Federal Office for Victims of Crime, the New York State Governor's Council on Reentry and Community Reintegration, and the Advisory Board to the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. She co-facilitates the monthly Executives Undoing Racism group with the Anti-Racist Alliance in New York, and holds numerous degrees from Emory, NYU, and Oxford, and was also a Rhodes Scholar, as if that wasn't enough. Danielle, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the folks.
Thank you so much, Emilio. Thank you all for having me. It's a real delight to be with you, and DA Chisholm, it's really a delight to follow you. I know that you have stepped out on restorative justice long before it was cool, and always have really high regard for people in the criminal justice system and for elected officials who demonstrate a readiness to do what's right before it's entirely evident that it's popular. And so really want to celebrate that and hope that that gets held as a Milwaukee tradition as we think about the things that we might steer into further that are right and that I actually believe may be more popular than we think. So thank you. And I'm really just looking so forward to the conversation with the fellow panelists in a minute. So I will keep my promise and talk for a while before jumping into that panel, but know that if I had my way, I would go straight there to start listening. So thanks all so much. I direct Common Justice, where we develop and advance solutions to violence that meet the needs of those harmed, advance racial equity, and don't rely on incarceration. We understand in this work, at the core of it, we operate an alternative to incarceration and victim service program based in restorative justice practices for serious and violent felonies. So in cases like robberies and assault, with the consent of the district attorney and of the victim of the crime, cases are diverted into a 15-month intervention where our participants go through an intensive preparatory period. Partway through, the people responsible for harm sit down with those they've harmed and reach agreements about how to make things as right as possible. And over the next year, in addition to our year-long violence intervention curriculum, keep those promises, fulfill those agreements. And if they do so, they don't go to prison. The felony charges against them are dismissed. And in the meantime, we work with the victims of their crimes to help them come through what happened to them and in their lives generally. And we started this work, I started planning it back in 2006. We launched in 2008. And we started it in part because we knew that we cannot end mass incarceration without addressing the question of violence. More than half of people locked up in the United States are locked up for crimes of violence. And so that means we will not see transformative reductions, including just a return to the levels that characterized this country when I was born, which, despite the opinions of the adolescents I work with, is not actually centuries ago. We won't get there without tackling violence. It's a numerical problem, but it's also a cultural problem. The reason we choose prisons over schools, prisons over roads, prisons over, for example, a public health infrastructure capable of delivering vaccines rapidly, to pick a random example. The reason we make those choices is because we have been told for a very long time a story of some imagined monstrous other against whom we have to be protected at any cost. That story is as old as this country. It is frankly as steeped in racism as this country. And it is deeply unproductive to our actually addressing harm in a way that transforms it. But not only can we not end mass incarceration without addressing violence, I've increasingly come to understand we can't end violence without addressing mass incarceration. And part of what I want to talk about today is less about how do we end mass incarceration and more about how do we end violence. Because I believe, as people who are committed to safety, the central question for us should be what will keep people safe? What will prevent violence? And if the answer to that is a dramatic reduction in our use of prison, then we become obligated to do that, not simply because we understand prison as a grave site of social injustice, of civil inequities, of all of those things. We become obligated to use incarceration less simply because we're obligated to use things that advance safety. And so at Common Justice, there are 4 core pillars that we believe should guide all our responses to violence. And I'll talk about those pillars today as some framing for our conversation. The first pillar is that we believe responses to violence should be survivor-centered. That sounds obvious. In this country, we do all sorts of things in crime victims' names, mostly enhanced sentencing laws. You think of all the laws, Marcy's law and Sarah's law and Abby's law, most named after white women, where in their names do we extract draconian punishment to try and somehow address the pain that they experienced. And the problem is that the stories we've told about who survivors are and what they want are artificially monolithic. I say this as a white woman survivor of rape. I say this as a white woman who has lost people I love to murder. I say this as a white woman whose face looks like the faces on the victim service posters, right? So my victimization is in that subset that has been well valued in our country. And yet a young man of color is 10 times likelier than I am to be robbed and assaulted. And I am not as likely as people presume to want the person who hurt me incarcerated. And so I said at the beginning that at Common Justice, we only take people into the program if the victims of their crimes agree. And it's important to remember fewer than half of victims call the police in the first place. That's actually I would nominate that as one of the single most damning statistics about the criminal justice system we can find. And there are a lot of competitors for the most damning statistic, let's be clear. More than half don't choose it. When I was in school, 50% was an F. That's our starting point. Another half of those victims will drop out of the process before grand jury. So you have a quarter of victims. That means 75% of victims have already told us in some way that the solutions on offer to them in the criminal justice system don't work for them. They have voted with their legs. They have left that system and sought solutions elsewhere, or preferred no solution at all to what we have on offer. As somebody who is deeply survivor-centered in my philosophy, in my ethics, and in my work, I find that to be unconscionable. At Common Justice, we only work with cases post-indictment. So it means we work with the half of victims who called the police and the smaller half of those who stayed past grand jury. So arguably the jailingest subset of victims you'll find, victims who have proceeded in the process, knowing it is likely to result in the incarceration of the person who hurt them. And we ask these victims, would you rather see the person who hurt you go to common justice, or would you rather have them in prison? And 90% choose common justice, 90%. It's a wild number. And when we first started to see it, I was very encouraged about humanity. I thought we're more merciful than I knew. We are more forgiving. We think, but for the grace of God go I. We know that we have made mistakes. We love people who have made mistakes. We prefer to see someone change. And I think that's true in maybe 30% of the cases. But I think there is a bigger truth behind that 90% that is really critical to how we think about the transformation of our responses to violence. And it's something that, frankly, I should have known as a survivor myself. The best way I've been able to describe it is that as survivors, we will feel pain so profound that we would wring out our bones to be free of it in the marrow there. And we will feel fear so intense that in the safety of our own homes, in the arms of the people we love and trust most, we will be unable to sleep. And when exhaustion finally takes us, we will wake from that sleep over and over again with nightmares. And we will feel rage so all-consuming, it makes us unrecognizable even to ourselves. But at the end of the day, survivors are pragmatic. There are two things we cannot stand. We cannot stand the idea of going through it again, and we cannot stand the idea of someone else going through what we went through. And so when we are faced with a choice, we will choose the thing that prevents those things we cannot stand. And as we feel the loss, and as we tremble with the fear, and as we seethe with the rage, we will choose the thing that is in our self-interest, because those other outcomes are intolerable. And the hardest people to persuade that incarceration will deliver on those promises are people who live in neighborhoods where incarceration is common, because they have paid for prison's failure to produce safety with their enduring pain. The United States locks up more of our own people than any nation in all of human history. If incarceration worked to produce safety, we would be the safest country ever to have been known. We would never bury one of our own. It doesn't produce safety. And people who live in neighborhoods where violence is common also live in neighborhoods where incarceration has been common. And so they don't just have to read a statistically significant study talking about the ways in which incarceration is criminogenic to be persuaded that it's not a good idea. They can do an inventory of what they have seen and experienced and know that the notion that incarceration will keep them safe is not one that puts them at ease enough to sleep at night. And so when they choose common justice over incarceration, they don't all do it because they're merciful. Some of them, their first choice would be to kill the person who hurt them, but they judge that they don't want to pay the consequence for it, morally or practically. Some of them, their first choice would be to see that person go away forever. I think about one of our harm parties when he was offered this choice. He said it was a first-degree robbery, and he said, can the person get life without parole? And I said, the New York statute doesn't allow that for this crime. And he said, well, then let's do common justice. So that seems crazy to someone who thinks only through a lens that's about punishment, right? That I want life without parole, but my second choice is nothing, right? It seems weird, right? But if you are that person's neighbor, if you know, as is true, that more than 95% of people who are locked up will come home, his preference is to eradicate this person. He doesn't care about him more than he cares about himself. He would love to never deal with him again. That would be his preference. But if that is not available, what he said to me is, I want him changed, and not in the way that prison's going to change him if I'm going to be his neighbor. Right. And so his decision then is one that is about his self-interest. I think about one mother I met with whose 14-year-old son was robbed and badly beaten. And because he was under 18, she had the decision about whether the young man who hurt him would go to prison or come to common justice. That young man was facing 3 years on the case. And she said to me, you know, when this first happened to my child, first I wanted that other young man. She didn't call me young man. She used a different word that I will not use in this polite company. She said, you know, when this first happened, first I wanted that young man to drown to death. And then I wanted him to burn to death. But then I realized as a mother, I don't want either of those things. I want him to drown in a river of fire, so I don't have to choose. And she said, but 3 years from now, my 9-year-old son's going to be 12, and he's going to be going to and from school and to and from the corner store and to and from his aunt's house alone. And one day he's going to pass that young man on the street. And I have to ask myself on that day to have been upstate, or do I want him to have been with y'all? And she said, now, if he were before me today and I had my machete, not a machete, my machete, we do a lot of risk assessment at Common Justice, and my machete is a much more imminent risk. If he were before me today and I had my machete, I would chop him to bits and bury him in my backyard and sleep soundly for the first night since he dared lay hands on my baby. But the truth is, I'd rather him be with y'all. So what that mother did was prioritize the safety of her child and of children like him over her own emotional rage. I am now a mother. I don't know that a mother is obligated to do that. Frankly, I'm not sure that I could. But what I do know is that the criminal justice system is obligated to do that. That the criminal justice system, I don't see any moral basis for the criminal justice system to be positioned to choose the emotionality of revenge over the practicality of safety. And so I think that obligation that that mother upheld is probably beyond what she owes, but the way we behave in the criminal justice system falls very, very short of our obligation to safety and those who depend on us and the way we exert our power. The second principle we believe should guide responses to violence are that they should be accountability based. This one also sounds obvious. We always say they did something and they have to be held accountable. Not always in that manly voice. But I think in this country, we talk about accountability and punishment as though they're synonymous. And not only are they not synonyms, I actually think in many ways they're antithetical. Punishment is passive. Punishment is something somebody does to me. All I have to do to be punished is not escape it. Accountability is different. Accountability as we view it at Common Justice, which is rooted in restorative justice philosophy and principles. Accountability requires acknowledging what I've done, acknowledging its impact, expressing genuine remorse, making things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those harmed, and becoming somebody who will never cause that kind of harm ever again. It is some of the hardest labor that any of us will ever do. And unlike punishment, it has the benefit of contributing to the healing of those who were harmed. So we talk about prison as though it does, but it doesn't work. Like what prison does for your pain is inflict more pain on someone else. And so imagine that you go to the doctor with a terrible back injury and you tell that doctor that you're in excruciating pain. What that doctor is not going to do is bring someone else in from the waiting room and bash them in the back with a baseball bat and ask you if you're now okay. Like however much we like the idea that other people's suffering might alleviate our pain, physiologically, it doesn't work. Post-traumatic stress does not care if the other person suffers. None of the symptoms associated with trauma diminish when someone else suffers. Our bodies do not care. What our bodies care about are our own healing. And so in accountability, in the part of that process where a survivor can have their questions answered, can have gaps filled in the narrative that they need to form in order to heal, can say, how dare you, can say, this is what it looks like to make it right. That accountability actually contributes to their healing. And similarly, the process of facing the harm we have done and becoming people who won't do it ever again is, in addition to being extraordinarily hard, is extraordinarily fruitful because it actually turns us into people who won't hurt others. And so unlike prison, which fails to do that, accountability is a lever of positive change in the individual and therefore for the people around them. I think we have less accountability in our criminal justice system than virtually anywhere in our culture. And as someone who is a deep believer in accountability, I believe in the displacement of punishment with accountability. Every single participant in our program at some stage has said they should have just done the time because of how hard it is. I'm proud of that. I don't believe that repair should be easy, but I do believe it should be dignifying. I don't believe that when somebody hurts somebody, that there is an excuse for it, no matter what pain they've been through. And at the same time, I believe that when we hurt someone, we incur an obligation. And that obligation is not to suffer in a cage somewhere. That obligation is not to be diminished and demeaned. That obligation is to make it right. And there is nothing in our current system that holds anyone to that obligation. And I believe that there should be. And I believe that the effect of holding people to that obligation means we actually get a society that centers the values of survivors, of people who've caused harm, and achieves the project of safety. A third principle we believe should guide responses to violence is that they should be safety driven. You may be thinking my principles are getting increasingly obvious, but I would argue that this is also one that we talk about all the time, but not honestly. So there is a debate about whether incarceration makes an enormous contribution to safety or a small contribution to safety or no contribution to safety. I think the debate actually misses the fourth answer and right answer to that question, which is that incarceration is actually productive of violence. And so the literature on this will demonstrate that incarceration has a criminogenic effect, meaning that two similarly situated people, one of whom is incarcerated and the other isn't, the one who is incarcerated is likelier to not only commit more crime, but more serious crime. So even somebody who only committed a nonviolent misdemeanor after being incarcerated is likelier to commit violence than somebody who, for instance, got away with it. So it's another case in which the same way victims are voting at the beginning, in which our intervention is in many respects worse than nothing. And as somebody who is in the business of ending violence, this makes perfect sense to me. The core drivers of violence are structural. They are things like poverty, inequity, a lack of social service infrastructure, a lack of public health infrastructure, poor educational systems, all of those things. That's what generates violence. And those are the levers we pull if we want to end violence. But even on an individual level, because actually most people living in those conditions don't hurt people. People find a way through that pain that is not by inflicting pain. So on an individual level, the core drivers of violence are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. The core features of prison: shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. And so we have baked into our core response to violence exactly the things that generate it. It's like showing up at a house fire with a hose full of gasoline. That is not what you do if you want to put the flames out, and you are not being honest if you act surprised when they rage higher. And so I think all the time about what it would mean as someone who wants to see an end to violence to actually achieve that in our lifetime. And so my job then is to look in my culture for the things that are generative of violence and to seek to reduce or eradicate those things. That's what you do. And so as somebody who seeks to end violence, when I do an honest survey of my culture for the sources that generate it, incarceration emerges as a central and key culprit. And so my obligation to reduce the use of incarceration as substantially as humanly possible is actually not just about what I believe about the degradation inflicted upon people in prisons. It is about the way I uphold my obligation to end violence. The last principle we believe should guide our responses to violence is that they should be racially equitable. They never have been. So this is not a thing that is about returning to a time before there was a problem. It is about becoming a nation we have never been. And it's important to name that the racial inequities in the criminal justice system are not only affecting defendants. Defendants in that system face inequities from the point of arrest, the point of charging, of bail decisions, of plea offers, of sentence length, of parole being granted, of parole violations. Like at every point there is discretion, there is disparity, and shame on us for it. But survivors face similar inequities. Survivors of color are likelier to be disbelieved, are likelier to be blamed for their own victimization. Their own desires are less likely to be heeded as things that inform the outcome of a case. They are more likely to be charged with something that they didn't commit for having been present at a time when they were hurt. They are likelier to be denied victims' compensation based on a perception of their contributory conduct or for their failure to cooperate adequately with law enforcement to the satisfaction of law enforcement, including in cases where police believe they know more than they're saying. And that alone can become the basis of denying they're getting compensation for medical bills, then landing them with lifelong debt, right? So the inequities in that system touch everybody. And those are on us collectively. Like, we have long known this. Like, the research demonstrating the inequities in this system go back decades and decades and decades. And so there are two categories of us: those of us who knew and those of us who should have known. There's no other category. And anybody who's in either of those is obligated to repair the vast harm we have done. And the harm we have done to people who've been locked up, the harm we have done to survivors in selling them a solution to their pain that did not alleviate it, the harm we have done to communities in investing in a solution that drives further violence at the expense of solutions that could diminish it. That harm is on us to repair. And I actually believe the steps of that kind of repair are not, in fact, different than the steps we ask of an individual who's caused harm. That we acknowledge what we've done, we acknowledge its impact, we express genuine remorse, we make things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those harmed, and we become a people, we become a nation that never causes that harm ever again. I believe the question of whether America persists as a democracy depends on how we answer the question of whether or not we are ready to commit to repair. And I will say that people in the restorative justice movement don't know everything that's needed about a process like that. But what we do know is that what is possible on this side of a reckoning is never quite, like what is possible on the other side of a reckoning is never quite visible on this side of it. That there is something that happens in that process of acknowledgement, in that process of repair, in that process of imagining solutions and committing to one another, that breaks open a way of being with each other that we could not have begun to think was possible before we entered into it. And so I feel deeply grateful in this moment of so much divisiveness in our nation to know, based on over and over again, the individual transformations that I've had the privilege to witness, that should we choose to reckon with that, I believe fully that we can become a nation we've never been on the other side of that choice. And so I will stop there and turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Very enlightening. We are going to hear from 3 more panelists, and then we're going to open it up to the many questions we've been receiving. And there are lots of powerful questions here. So it is my pleasure now to jump over to Shannon Ross, and let me get his bio queued up real quick. Forgive me. Shannon has an incredibly powerful story, also connected to restorative justice. He runs the Community, which is an anti-mass incarceration organization focused on both pre-entry, which is really preparation before release, and proactively connecting with people outside the choir of justice reform. He is a graduate student at UW Milwaukee for the Sustainable Peacebuilding Program, a community fellow with the Wisconsin Decarceration Platform, and a co-instructor at Milwaukee School of Engineering and Marquette's Education Preparedness Program. He's also a partner with Reentry Rising Milwaukee and an organizer for Dream Corps' Day of Empathy, as well as a member of Unlock Higher Education. So Shannon, it's my pleasure to switch over to you. We'd love for you to share your experiences. I know you've had experience with restorative justice and have unique insights that you're prepared to share with us as well.
Yeah, definitely have experience with it. Thank you, Amelia. And thank you to my anti-mass incarceration colleagues here for taking the time to address this topic. And thank you, Danielle, for taking on and evangelizing a well-known secret to justice reform, which is violent offenses. What Emilio stated in the intro for me is far from everything I'm involved in and have done that can be considered an achievement or success in the social community sense. But that could easily have never happened because when I was 19, I killed a fellow teenager in cold blood. It was not an accident, it was intentional. And that was far from the only crime I committed back then. As crazy as it seems to those who have met me since then, I needed to be removed from society. I was a hurt, petty, reckless young man. You will find none of that in me now because I was and am incredibly fortunate in a number of ways. One of them was my encounter with restorative justice early on in my 17-year sentence. There was no one experience that pushed me over the virtuous edge and made me embrace humility, compassion, and correction with all my limbs. But I know restorative justice was one of the most significant influences in almost every person I know who has recovered from committing a violent crime, and the mess of a person they were at the time echoes that same sentiment. Hurt people hurt people. And we get emails about that fact from 9,000 readers inside that we have in our newsletter commonly. People who don't understand why restorative justice doesn't exist more in the prison system, who've gone through it back when it did. And even when it was more of a presence years ago, it was nowhere near as available and prevalent as it should have been and can be. The work my organization does with our Correcting the Narrative campaign is premised on one of the key principles of restorative justice, connections. Whereas the system in America is premised on separation, on pushing issues and people away from each other, it's akin to cleaning your room by shoving everything in the closet and under the bed. But far worse, because these are people, families, and communities that create ripple effects that impact and collide far beyond themselves, even from places of confinement. Restorative justice makes connections before collisions. Hearing crime survivors talk about how they were affected and traumatized by acts I committed, sitting feet away, just merely close in the same circle from mothers whose sons had been killed, as they described the effect it had on them, affected me in a way no other program could have. It forced me to see the dirty room in my heart and mind, the destruction I wrought, and helped me be accountable in a way I don't know if I ever would have if not for restorative justice and the circle approach. The best people I know are people I spend years in prison with because there is no better way to know a person than doing time with them. Who they are cannot hide. And these are almost all people who have served long sentences for violent crimes, often committed as young men, and swear by the restorative justice, holistic impact restorative justice had on them in their journey. It's almost comical how obvious this is, that we have to have panels to talk about how the system and society should solve problems through connections, mediation, and communication, rather than avoidance and disregard is sad. That the system and legislators require so much evidence and lobbying to embrace programs and a culture of restorative justice is absurd when you think of how much evidence there is that the current retributive and fear-empowering approach has failed society since its beginning, and failed us boisterously and agonizingly. The solution is not hard to find. It's almost, I and Sean are so far from anomalies. There are thousands of people who committed violent crimes and even disgustingly violent crimes who have been restored by the principles of restorative justice, or who would be if given the chance. But they also need the chance to return to society to apply those lessons and growth for good. Lord knows we need it out here. A very good friend of mine says we are all the walking wounded. Another good friend calls us wounded healers. Restorative justice and expansions on restorative justice like transformative justice and unitive justice, which are fairly new. Transformative justice has been around for a little while, but unitive justice is a newer concept that's going on in some prisons. These are how we best turn walking wounded into wounded healers and genuinely begin to reduce the severity and frequency of pain and destruction none of us want to for ourselves or others. People, not monsters, commit violent crimes, especially crimes committed as teenagers. Sean and I are just two examples of what can be achieved by the principles of restorative justice. There are so many more.
Thank you, Shannon. It's my pleasure to now switch over to and introduce my former colleague and longtime friend, Sean Wilson. So Sean is an experienced organizer and activist, mentor, and the Smart Justice campaign manager for the ACLU of Wisconsin. He too is a native of Milwaukee and is driven by his lived experience with the criminal justice system. He has committed to advocating for system-wide transformational change, and he's also a commissioner on the governor's Juvenile Justice Commission. If you want to see more of Sean, You can catch him on HBO Max in the documentary Growing Up Milwaukee. And I'm going to share the link for the Smart Justice campaign in the chat, as well as for some of the things that Shannon mentioned just moments ago. So over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Emilio. And thank you, Danielle, for being here with us today. I must say that my colleague, Molly Collins, is a big fan of you, and she is the person who introduced me to your content, Until We Reckon, in various videos on YouTube. And I'm very grateful for that, because the campaign that we are running here at the ACLU is a campaign, a nationwide campaign that is committed to reducing the jail and prison populations here in the United States of America, and specifically here in Wisconsin. And so we recognize and we all acknowledge that we are a state, we are a country that incarcerates 25% of our population, representing 5% of the world's population. And so the Smart Justice Campaign is committed to reducing the jail population and the prison population in our own unique way. We are committed to reimagining how we bring about criminal legal reform in the country, as well as in the state of Wisconsin specifically. And so when I think about restorative justice, I think about how we as a society have been socialized that a just response is punitive. Growing up, when we caused harm, we were punished. In the home, we were sent to our room, or in the house, or in some case, in the home, we were sent to our rooms, or in some cases, we got a spanking. In school, it was detention, suspension, or in worst cases, it was expulsion. And then when we look at the broader society, when you commit a harm, the response is typically jail or prison. And so my formal understanding of restorative justice is that it's a theory of justice that emphasizes repairing the harm caused by criminal behavior. And so I'm very grateful to Danielle Sered's book, Until We Reckon, because that has informed me a great deal of how we can reimagine criminal legal reform through the use and implementation of restorative justice. I'm also grateful to, I would be remiss if I didn't mention my sister Heather Sattler and Sharon Lehrman, who taught me Circle. And also my brother Roderick Bankston, who also let me know that when I am applying and speaking about restorative justice, you must use an anti-racist lens in doing that work. And so when I think about how restorative justice views the criminal legal system, I think about how it looks at the whole. It looks at the harm that has been caused to individuals. It looks at the harm that has been caused to communities. It looks at the entire spectrum of what has taken place here. Whereas when I think about how the criminal legal system views harm, it looks at a violation of a statute. It looks at a violation of social order. And it says that accountability needs to be had. And so as Danielle articulates in her book, you know, our accountability within the criminal legal system is always punitive. And what happens is that cases are adjudicated and these individuals are sent away to these rural areas to serve their time, and the victim goes home to deal with their trauma. And so restorative justice is definitely a practice that I really believe that our criminal legal system needs to adopt to begin to address the reliance that we have on sending people away to languish in cages. I believe that this is a practice that will really begin to restore the harm that has been perpetrated, not only by the perpetrator, but in many instances by the system itself, because the system has not provided these victims with a means to heal. And then we have to really become a little bit more bolder and courageous in how we implement restorative justice. Because now, I mean, here in Milwaukee, and John has spoken to this, they're doing restorative justice, but not necessarily implementing restorative justice as it relates to violent cases. And we know that if we're going to reduce the jail and prison populations, we have to begin to ask ourselves, how do we incorporate and implement restorative justice in those cases of violence? Because these are the people who are harmed, who are greatly, and I don't want to, say one trauma is better or worse than the next, but someone who experienced a stolen car compared to someone who has been robbed, I mean, you can't necessarily compare the two, but I think in those type of situations, restorative justice should be offered and implemented so that we can really begin to give people the treatment of the trauma that they have just encountered as a result of having a gun or knife placed to them in their possession, taken away from them. And then we have to put individuals who perpetrate these acts of violence in the situation where they understand what caused them to commit this act of violence. We have to put them in a situation where they begin to acknowledge the harm that they've caused. And as Shannon said, hurt people. So what led up to this person committing this act of violence? And then the victim wants to know, as many of you have indicated, why me? What did I do to be robbed? What did I do to be assaulted? And so these are the things that we have to begin to consider when we're talking about restorative justice. And in order for us to really have transformational change within our criminal legal system, we have to begin to apply restorative justice to violent cases that come into the courts and into our offices as prosecutors and judges.
Thank you, Sean. Very powerful. And you mentioned something which makes for a natural segue to Dr. Terri Strodthoff, who is our final panelist, who works at the Alma Center. Dr. Terri Strodthoff received her PhD from the University of Michigan and her BA here at Marquette University. She is the founder and executive director of the Alma Center. The Alma Center was started in 2005 and is a community-based agency in Milwaukee working to heal, transform, and evolve the unresolved pain of trauma that fuels the continuation of cycles of violence, abuse, and dysfunction in families and our city. The Alma Center works primarily with men at risk or involved in the criminal justice system, with a particular focus on men who have a history of domestic violence. Dr. Strodthoff has more than 25 years in the field and is a groundbreaker in the treatment and disruption of these brutal cycles. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Strodthoff. I'm going to call Terri from this point forward.
Thank you, Emilio. Thanks. Oh my gosh, Danielle, thank you for your fire. And to you too, Sean and Shannon. It's so great to be inspired by you and to feel that. I listened to your book on tape, Danielle, and I wish you had read it because I would have been running around my house like seriously on fire. I'm aware there are a ton of questions on the chat, so I'm going to be really brief in my comments here. But I think that the thing that I've been thinking about as everybody was talking is I was reminded of an experience I had driving past the prison in Green Bay with I think she was 4 years old, maybe 5 and 3 years old, my niece and nephew in the car. We drove past the prison. They live very close to it. And she said, "Oh, there's where all the bad people are." And she was 4 or 5 years old. And I said, "That's not where bad people are, Claire. That's where we keep people who have made mistakes." And she was utterly unmovable at 5 years old from her understanding of that this is where the bad people are. And I say that to say that how we think about these problems, how we think about what's going on and how we understand it is how we create our solutions. And if a 4-year-old in our community can believe that this is the house of bad people, then we have a really serious problem about how we create solutions to this. And so I think that in the work that we do around domestic violence, we've created an understanding of people who perpetrate violence as monsters that will stop at nothing to harm their family and eventually to kill their family. And certainly that describes some people, but it doesn't describe the majority of the people that we see. And so it's really important to understand what is going on in an accurate and a human way, like what happened to the people and how did they get to this place, and how do we address the reality of the problem and not just the monster version of the problem that we created. And I think when we get to addressing the reality of the problem, it goes to what I guess everybody on the panel has been saying, and is at the fundamental core of restorative justice, is that we are restoring something. And we're restoring something. And all of us have been in the position, I imagine, of seeing, witnessing, holding a baby. And it's so clear that every person is born into this world whole. I mean, that's the fundamental belief that I have, that we have in our programming. And if we're born whole, in our loving and lovable self, in our capable self, in our curious self to grow up and to thrive, then the question we should be asking ourselves when that doesn't happen as teenagers or adults is like, what happened to this person that they're acting out in this way, that their wholeness has been, what's the word I want to say? That their wholeness has been disconnected. They've been disconnected from the truth of who they are. So how do we restore this person back to the truth of who they are in a way that actually helps them to engage in with themselves, with their family, and with their community in ways that are about their truth, that are about thriving? And I think about that in the area of domestic violence, because we know that this initial harm to most people happens in their home. And it's just the reality of what we need to talk about. And then when we talk later on about violence, we seem to like have a disconnect with that. Like, this is the early places that we land teach us about the world that we're in. And if the early places that we land in big ways of abusive ways and in less big ways of just not getting what we need, teach us that it's a dangerous world, that it's a world we have to survive, then we learn how to survive in that world in ways that are not about our thriving. And we find other people who that makes sense with, right? So when we think about addressing the violence that gets perpetrated as adults, to me, we go back to understanding that. How do we restore people? Both the people who, I mean, everybody who is perpetrating harm has experienced harm. That's unquestionably the truth that I've experienced. And so how do we restore those people to their truth, and how do we restore the people that they've harmed? And this is like, I can't imagine there's 110 people on this presentation right now, Danielle. I would hope that every single one of them, as you were talking, was like, duh, like, this is so obvious. How do we get to the reality of restoration instead of what we're doing right now? And I'm looking forward to the questions and the discussion that follows around that. Thank you.
Thank you, Terri. Yeah, we took a dip after the lunch break ended. So when it hit 1 o'clock, we started to have trickle down. And thank you, all of you, Danielle and all the distinguished panelists, for your different insights. We have so many questions, and it's going to be very big and complicated series. So we're going to ask for you to go deep in a few things. Also know, as a reminder, this will be shared on YouTube. All the questions will be shared publicly. We're going to make them anonymous so that you can feel free to ask a question in the chat, but I won't put your name in that question later so that we can share it publicly. And we're going to share these questions with not only all the participants of this panel, but with the previous and the subsequent participants. Several of you have referred to people who will be here in the next two panels, and you can find out how to access the other panels in the chat there, which is bit.ly/MKE. lowercase word restore. And we'll be practicing circles in a way similar to the restorative justice process in the final and the fourth installment on February 25th with Sharon Lehrman, Heather Sattler, and some friends from Project Return. All those circles will be led by either young people or previously incarcerated people. Actually, you'll have both in each circle facilitating. So now on to the juicy bit, all the questions. And I'm going to ask a variety of questions. There are questions, showing a variety of understandings. Certainly, and we've received this last week as well as this week, why are we drawing a distinction in our speech, friends, between violent and nonviolent crimes? And why, too, is this distinction also in our criminal legal system? Why do we need to make this distinction between how we're addressing violence with a large V as it pertains to all elements of society, but also how the courts see a violent crime versus a nonviolent crime, whether that affects misdemeanor or felony. That's an open question to all of you.
I'm happy to jump in. I would say two things. Like first, the legal classification of violent and nonviolent crime is weird. Like there are a bunch of things that are classified as violent crime that don't involve any physical injury to anyone, that don't involve even the threat of physical force. Some of the burglary crimes that get classified as violent, even when nobody is present. It's weird, right? So there is a lot in our penal code where things that either are classified as violent in a way that none of us colloquially would understand as violent, or where things that involve really minimal physical harm are classified as violent in order to put them in a charge class that makes available much more punitive responses. And so I think there is a lot of valuable work to be done in thinking about reclassifying those things and making a more sensible alignment between like charges and the actual harm that's caused. And at the same time, I will say some things are violent and they're wrong and they hurt people. And they hurt people in ways no one has right to hurt anybody. And while I don't want to get into a sort of hierarchy of oppression of whether, being robbed at gunpoint or having your home burglarized when you're not there is worse, right? Like I don't see anything productive in fighting about which is worse. And it's only really the criminal legal system that is assigning a number to each of those things that has to decide which is worse. Right? Because then you have to decide, well, is this worth 5 or 10? And if I sign up 5, it's it's not as bad as that thing I gave a 10 to, right? Like it's absurd. Because the truth is like what makes it worse is a combination of all sorts of factors, like how it actually impacted that person, the degree to which they could repair the loss, the degree to which they had healing supports. Maybe for some of us, the intent of the person matters, but a ton of things that are outside of the scope of any kind of penal code. What is not weird is restorative justice, which is just fiercely proportional, because what you're doing is addressing the harm, not the rule breaking. And so it means in some cases, some of our cases that have the most serious charges are not always the deepest harm. And some of our cases that have seemingly slightly less serious charges are horrifying, lasting impacts for the people they affect. And so one of the things I love about restorative justice is its like unfaltering proportionality and the way in which in choosing it, we do not have to exercise a judgment about the relative value of different people, including different survivors. Because once we do that, we do really ugly things. Like not only do we say, we care about your robbery, but not about your burglary. It's very weird in the penal code in the United States that like for an assault in order to be a B felony in New York has to include very serious injury, but an armed robbery is similar. So once property is in, we're like, once property is in, that just straight to the top, right? Which is not necessarily how people experienced harm. And the truth is like your physiological response to trauma doesn't give a F about your wallet. It's not aligned with human experience. And so one of the things that I think gives us like so much room to actually reckon with the pain that's caused is in a restorative justice process. What's centered is that pain, not the rules that were broken. And so absolutely, so long as we're working within a criminal legal system that has to assign a number to a certain kind of hurt, then we want to get those as properly aligned as is possible in a framework that not only is going to value certain kinds of harm, but also certain kinds of people, where fundamentally they'll say, oh, if the victim was also a gang member, they'll say if the victim also had a criminal justice record, if the victim was inebriated, if the victim's skirt was too short, like all of those things end up reducing the number. But what those things don't reduce is the harm that that person survived. Like I won't tell any of you what I was wearing when I was raped, because shame on you if you think it matters. Shame on you. And shame on all of us who've ever asked that question of anybody. And so the numerical value is weird. And when you talk to people like mothers who have lost their children to murder, they're like, how many years replaces the loss of my child? Like it's the wrong units, right? They're like, the only unit that feels like it could matter is if I could take that person's life. And even that doesn't feel right because then I have to be someone who took a life and I don't want to be that. And it's like, there's no but we're using the wrong measures, we're using the wrong units. And so whatever number we use is wrong. Like if you're trying to buy something with the wrong currency and you're in a country and they're like, we don't accept that currency. And you're like, here's a different bill. They're like, it's paper, take it away. You can't have this. And we can't have justice in that same way if we're relying on a currency that doesn't have real basis and meaning.
Thank you. And I just want to also reiterate, everyone can feel free to answer some of these open-ended questions. And I want to again invite Ron Johnson, who I know originally wasn't able to join us from Madison, is now able to join us. And I invite you, if there's anything you want to share, as well as answer any of these questions, you're more than welcome to. Okay, I think you may be on mute.
Right. Thank you very much. I just want to say thank you for inviting me to this discussion. I'm recently retired, so it's kind of a refreshing feeling to be sort of back in the loop. I've done a number of work with some of you there, particularly Big John Chisholm. I've done a great deal of work with Aaron Katsky. Is Aaron still doing her conferencing, John? She does one of the best conferencing programs. I know this sounds like an exaggeration, but one of the best ones in the country. She is down to earth. She's sincere. She's very empathetic and has her mind wrapped around restorative justice. Some of the and of course I originally learned restorative justice through another DA, Mr. Lerman, who died a few years ago. But he taught many of us restorative justice. My main partner in the district attorney's office was a guy named Paul Didinsky. Now, Paul and I, we traveled around the city doing restorative justice for Milwaukee Public Schools. Milwaukee Public Schools had a reputation of expelling tons of kids, mostly Black and brown kids. And they came up with the superintendent at that time asked Paul and I to come up with some suggestions on how we could reduce kids that are expelled. Because when a kid is expelled, first of all, when a kid is suspended, they're more likely to be expelled. If they're expelled, they're more likely to find themselves involved in the criminal justice system. Once you're expelled, you cannot go attend a public school anywhere in the country. Once they seek your records and so forth, that public school will contact the other public school and you're barred. You can go to a private school, but that's another issue. So that was a very big deal that Paul and I worked for about 3 years on this, and we actually were able with other members of our team to reduce that number of kids being expelled, and we're very, very proud of that. Paul and I were like Martha and Snoop Dogg. We were, I'm Black, he's white. I was very ebonics and used humor a lot and told a lot of stories. The kids considered Paul kind of dorky. He was like 6'4", told white guy jokes. Kids were like, was that funny? But the crazy part about it is that the kids, they loved us. And so with my version and his version, the one thing about our personalities is that we were true and we weren't trying to fake it, and the kids knew that. And we were able to do some incredible things with some really tough kids. If I can just tell a quick story, one time we were at a school called Father Groppy. And I knew Father Groppy back in the day, and if he knew that this school, which had behavioral challenges, if he knew that school was named after him, he would probably turn over in his grave. But we went there one day and to do a regular session, and the principal pulled us to the side and said, could you guys talk to these girls? They're in a fight and we need to have this settled before the next hour. Well, whenever you're working in a school, be careful about time constraints that the schools put on you, because everything's got to be done before the next bell. Well, Paul and I sat down with these 6 girls, and it didn't take us long to realize that, one, we had made a mistake, in that we were taking on these girls that we didn't know, didn't have any relationship built with them, didn't know their characters, their personalities. We just walked into a cold, and they were angry. They were angry young sisters, and they cussed like drunken sailors. And eventually, after talking to both sides, Paul was in one room, I was in another room, and we were able to get them to stop cussing. I mean, that's the furthest we were able to get, is to get them to stop cussing. So then we say, okay, let's bring them together, because we knew that we had to bring them together before school was out, at least. Otherwise, it was going to be trouble. We talked to them, and it just didn't work. Sometimes, if you don't do it right, it just doesn't work. And restorative justice works better when you do pre-conferences and you will get to know the person. It's all about relationship building. So finally, I made the biggest mistake. This young lady asked me, she said, can I ask her a question? Well, I should have known not to let her ask an open-ended question without a preview. And I said, sure. And she said, bitch, why are you so crazy? And the girl that she called a bitch literally jumped over me and started choking me. And then all the girls started fighting, throwing chairs. And Paul and I, two guys, were like, okay, do we grab these little young warring sisters? If we grab them and touch them the wrong way, then we're in trouble. So as we were contemplating this, principal came in, grabbed both the girls by their belt. We couldn't have done that for sure. By the back of their belt and called them out of it. The crazy part about it is about 2 weeks later, I was speaking at a restorative justice conference, and who should walk down the aisle but the girl who called the other girl a bitch? And it was two of them. She was a twin. And I was like, oh my God. And something had happened to her. She had changed. Now she was presenting to the restorative justice program. And I talked to her about that later. She said that she kept going to the restorative justice classes, and it worked for her. It changed her attitude and eventually changed her life. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you too, and thank you for that story. Appreciate it. We have a series of questions, and they're based on the context of a lot of what you all have shared. One of the first ones we have is, based on some of the successes that have occurred in Dane County and Milwaukee County. For example, Donnetta shared that they just completed their 1,000th respondent has come through the program. That's a big deal. And based on the fact that DA Chisholm has shared that they've been experimenting and actually implementing restorative justice probably since the 90s in one form or another. How can we, with these accomplishments, make it possible for Milwaukee and Dane to create programs for violent cases similar to common justice? And I want to just add too that we do have listeners from La Crosse, Appleton, Oshkosh, Green Bay. So there are many other counties in the state, some of which La Crosse and Green Bay are experimenting and are in earlier phases of restorative justice. So that question is also to Danielle, who's seen this implemented and has a successful program in New York. You can tell from my accent, I grew up there too. And also based on the insights of D.A. Chisholm and Donnetta Foxx.
One place I would start is that we have, in fact, for the first time, focused on the family violence issue and working with Terri. And believe me, that in itself took a huge leap of faith, because a lot of times we want to fall back on what does the data show actually works. And the reality is nobody's ever wanted to study the issue of domestic violence in terms of therapeutic interventions, because there weren't any for a long period of time. That's where again Terri and the entire victim, Terri's background is in advocating for people who need advocacy, that are vulnerable. And yet it was really Terri and Carmen Petrie from the Sojourner Family Peace Center that said, we have to take it, if you believe that we can impact the lives of kids that have been exposed to violence, then you have to acknowledge that those kids grow up to be young people and young adults, and that they are still suffering from the same problems. And unless we address that, you're going to be continuing to struggle with the problem. And I will just say, Danielle, it's just a beautiful book. I mean, it follows the whole progress, both from the personal level to the community level to the national level of what we're trying to struggle. How do we do this? I'm a firm believer that you have to completely change the resources you put into the front end of the system, right? Our system, I go back to that frozen moment in time. Our system is just built on the notion that accountability has to be directed at an act, and that there has to be somebody who committed an act that has to be held accountable, and there has to be somebody that is the victim of that act. And again, like I said, we don't really look too much into the history leading up to that act, or even think about what's going to occur after that act. The whole system is built upon responding to that act, and that's just the way we operate. So in my view, to build the capacity to meaningfully approach issues, and like I said earlier, victims, when you're talking to a victim that's just been victimized, and I really appreciated what Shannon says, well, and when you're talking to a young person that's just been arrested for committing a violent offense, that might mean, and just like Ron Johnson just said, just as the story he said, that might not be the perfect time to lock in everybody's opinion of what should be done with the case, but that's what we do. Realistically, that is what we do. We talk to the victim. What do you want? I want him to go away for prison for life. You look at the person that is alleged to have committed the offense, and the only history you look at is how many times have they been arrested and convicted before. We don't really, that's just the way it's designed. So in order to do it, you almost have to build some different options, some cooling down periods into it. And again, that's anathema to the criminal justice system. You got to move these cases forward all the time. And so it's actually, sometimes just taking a deep breath and figuring out if there's other ways to accomplish it. But it is not going to be easy any more than, but I would also argue that what I will tell you has shocked me is the success rate for the men that have gone through Terri's program. We now have the data that will support this. It's now hundreds of people in the last couple of years that have done this. And it's about an 85 to 90% success rate. 85, 90%. That's better than we're doing in a lot of our other early intervention areas. So that tells you again that but it's hard. I'm just going to tell you, it's hard for system actors to step outside of that system sometimes, particularly when the resources are just so scarce.
Hey, Terri, does James Mosley still work with you? He's a gift.
Thank you. I'm gonna hope that Danielle and maybe Donnetta can talk briefly about how you got this implemented common justice in New York, because certainly the barriers to this type of inclusion are not different from what DA Chisholm is expressing are here. So how did a city much larger than Milwaukee, much larger than the population of our state, get this implemented?
Sure, it's my pleasure. So, I mean, in part, I'm like, do you have 6 weeks and some whiskey? But I'll give you the shorter version, given our restrictions on time.
I have a fully stocked bar downstairs.
I think the first thing that has to happen is that a program in your city has to develop the capacity to implement a model that you can trust will prevent people who have very recently caused serious harm from causing serious harm, right? You have to know that it will work at least the vast majority of the time. And that program needs to be adequately resourced. It needs money for infrastructure. It needs money for staff. It needs money for a period where they are just training up, not an expectation that they get hired and 2 days later are doing it. You need money for consultants. They need to be well resourced. And I mean, clearly it should be a nonprofit, not the district attorney's office resource to do it, because it is important that it is a neutral party and a party outside of the criminal justice system that holds this kind of work. And so there needs to be an entity in the community that can really do it. And not just that could do it in the future, but that's ready to do it. Then the district attorney needs to say yes, and needs to say an unequivocal yes and a clear yes, and to say a yes that is proportionate to the skill of that group, to the demonstrated evidence of these kinds of interventions, and to be willing to really do it not by kind of picking out 2 exceptional cases here and there, but saying this whole body of cases we are by default going to consider as likely appropriate. And sometimes we will remove ones. We'll say this case actually is too much for us for these reasons. But our default assumption is going to be that this is an appropriate response to this serious body of cases. That's what the district attorney in Brooklyn has done. And that default approach has not just increased the case flow, but has had a huge benefit in guarding against implicit bias. Where if you have to actively fight to include somebody, all these things interfere. Whereas if you have to actively make the argument to exclude somebody, we get much closer to an equitable distribution of opportunity. So the DA respectively has to say yes. I think that's just one of the key steps. And then you all, whomever, the remaining attendees on this call and all of you on the screen and others, have to stand by the district attorney, have to help build community buy-in for this. When something goes wrong, because something will go wrong, like you don't get to throw him under the bus. He can't stand at the podium alone answering for it. And he can't stand just with you, because if he's at the podium answering for it, he's answering for his affiliation with you. So your presence won't be enough to protect him. So it means that you have to have crime survivors who are willing to say, I have suffered harm, and I know this happened in this case in a way it shouldn't have, but I still believe in this because I know the old solutions wouldn't have kept me safe. And this one maybe didn't this time, but most of the time it will. You need members of community boards and other formations to say, the DA did it because we told him to. And even in response to this failure, we are telling him to continue, like as his constituents, as people who back this. You need faith leaders who will stand there and do that, because I think it is really, it's a funny time in America to say you believe in representative democracy, but I'm still really into it. And what that means is that I don't actually think it's reasonable to ask an elected to go substantially far out ahead of their constituency. And I believe that an elected is most accountable to the people impacted by his or her choices. And so it is the communities in Milwaukee whose members are likeliest to be in the criminal justice system, whose opinions about the criminal justice system should dictate that office's behavior. And that's just like, I'm like a democracy kind of girl. Like that's the conclusion, if you believe in representative democracy, is that the constituents whose lives are at stake in a decision should be the ones whose opinions affect the person they have elected to make those decisions. And so that accountability has to be present, and that support has to be present. And what we know in New York is that if you ask people in neighborhoods where incarceration and violence are prevalent, you will find support for these kinds of interventions. And it's at that point that an elected is supported in moving forward. Like sometimes, because if he or she doesn't move forward, they will be stampeded by the crowd behind them moving forward, but also like dare anyone to come at them from behind when the people are there behind them. And so it's that alignment that I think is really important. And I think it's important that we're honest about the political dynamics around it. It's important that those of us who want to see these interventions grow take responsibility for organizing and helping create a political climate in which this is a responsible choice for an elected, as opposed to just trying to persuade an elected to make a decision that appears out of sync with the overall preferences of his or her constituency. And so I think you organize, you build power, like you make clear that that is the demand, and then you act like a representative democracy and accede to that demand, because that's the job. And so I think there is a really reciprocal obligation in that. And I think to the degree we think either side will move forward just by being persuaded of the merits of restorative justice is just not adequate. We have to be honest about the political circumstance and account for that in what we build and how we implement and in how we ensure an intervention really can grow to scale and really be durable.
Thank you. I'm wondering too, connected to what you're saying and something that has come up repeatedly in the questions. You touched upon implicit bias, and Milwaukee and also Wisconsin is one of the most grossly disproportionate carceral states for Black men and boys and for Indigenous men and boys. And given the, I mean, the ACLU just won this lawsuit against the Milwaukee Police Department. People are asking questions about the egregious statistics here. Not only Milwaukee County, Brown County, Dane County, Rock County. So given the pre-contact that Black men and boys will have had with law enforcement, how does this affect their eligibility for programs via pretrial assessment, via whether or not there is an eligibility to participate in the Milwaukee or the Dane County programs? And how do you, Danielle, or have you, Terri, because I know, Terri, you work a lot with folks who are accused of having committed domestic violence, and many of the clients you serve also fit into this demographic of folks who have had a disproportionate encounter with law enforcement. How do you navigate that so that we can begin accomplishing some of what Danielle just expressed?
It's certainly the case in Milwaukee County. We have 19 municipalities in Milwaukee County, and about 83%, I think, of the domestic violence cases come from the city of Milwaukee. If we believed that this behavior was confined to the city of Milwaukee, that would make sense. But obviously we know that's not the case. It's an issue of policing, and it's an issue of what we think is appropriate response for communities. And frankly, it's an issue of how we've defined the problem, because we created an image that domestic violence is, like I said, this monster that is out there to terrorize their family. But then in white families that are not part of the police happens in our community, we allow Uncle Joe to act in ways that he would be arrested for in the city of Milwaukee, and we don't define that as domestic violence. We define that as that's just the way Uncle Joe is in his relationship. So there's many problems about the way that we do this, and I think that this opportunity of being able to open it up to the reality and to say, like, let's understand what people want and what people want to happen, what the victims want to happen, how messy these relationships can be, how not like the way that we've created this problem, how many of them are not like the way that we've created this problem, and we've created a solution for a very small end. And I think the district attorney's office opening up to the idea, like, wow, let's listen, let's really listen to what people want to happen in their family. We know that right now, our data shows us that over 60% of the men in our program, that's post-adjudication, they've been charged, they've been sentenced, they've spent time in prison, they're on probation, 60% are still with their same partner in a domestic violence case. Our solution is not responsive to what is actually happening in their families, and this gives us a different opportunity. And it gives us an opportunity to be able to use the kind of solutions and the kind of intervention that is done in other communities outside of the criminal justice system, because that is happening as well. People are using white communities are using alternate means of addressing this. That's not in the criminal justice system, and it makes no sense that that's available for communities, that the 18 municipalities outside the city of Milwaukee, but not within the city of Milwaukee.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add to that? Okay. And maybe DA Chisholm or Donnetta Foxx, can you explain how your systems currently navigate for making sure that racial bias or pretrial assessment doesn't weed out a lot of men and women that might need this program?
Sure. You know, this is a very legitimate concern. When we first started the early interventions program, you know, we brought you know, a number of experts in, and it was not just focused on one aspect of creating a diversionary or a alternative pathway, it was also focused on things like bail reform and trying to figure out different types of assessments, right? So the primary one was, to boil it down, what's the, from the standpoint of prosecutor, what's the likelihood of this person going out and hurting somebody again, is really what it comes down to. That is the primary concern we have is whether someone's going to go out and commit another act of violence. In legal terms, it's always assessed in terms of likelihood to return to court, things like that. But the practical reality that any judge or any DA in looking at a case is, what's the likelihood of this person, if released back into the community, is going to harm somebody else, is really the way to look at it. So by collaborating closely with the public defender's office and by creating that front end assessment system, and more than just the assessment, providing them the resources to help people actually be monitored safely when they're in the community, I think that's the kind of the approach that you have to take to it, is that you use the assessments to inform people, but we always say that it's just for that. It doesn't override anybody's discretion one way or the other. It's just an additional piece of information that you can use to make that assessment. The other thing is, the thing that's kind of hidden from most of the assessments is also just a practice, right? And that is nobody is coerced into a diversion or an early intervention or drug treatment court, right? We don't proceed with cases unless we can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Believe it or not, that's a huge screening factor. So the studies that have looked at Milwaukee show that we screen out about 50 to 60% of all the cases that come to us within the first couple of days. So if somebody isn't charged and you don't wait for a couple of weeks to decide whether you're going to proceed with the case or not, we do that screening up front. So the next category down, those that could be charged, but we want to do something different with, is by definition, the evidence is more sufficient in that sense. So you kind of go through that process as you're moving along. But the reality is you desperately need more of those types of resources. The current environment is instructive, I think. The system, having effectively been shut down for the last year, has really reduced the ability of those early interveners, you might want to argue, to do what they do best. I know a lot of people will flip it around, and I don't want what I'm saying interpreted this way. A lot of people will flip it around and say that the reason the violence is spiraling out of control in Milwaukee right now is because we're not putting more people in jail or prison or things like that. Really, I think the system being closed down is hurting our ability to identify problems and intervene. And so I don't think the solution should be that we have to open everything up so we can put more people in jail and prison. We have to get things back to where school officials can intervene, public health workers can more effectively intervene, identify people with mental illness quicker and get them the proper resources. But it's a huge challenge right now. We just are going through a historically high period of time where the index of social suffering in Milwaukee is pretty much off the scale.
If I can, I'd like to defer that question to Ron. Ron Johnson was the one that actually started and was boots on grounds when this diversion program in Madison started off. And he has more of the history, the criteria, and the assessment, and why we chose what we do. And so if you don't mind, Ron, I'd like you to kind of pick up there and just kind of give the audience the beginnings of community restorative court.
That would be great. If I could just preface with 2 minutes for that response, and then we're going to get into house cleaning. I know Danielle has to leave in 2 minutes as well.
Well, restorative justice has been practiced in Dane County for maybe 2 decades. It started off in the public school system. And then eventually it made it to the police department. There was a police officer, a couple of police officers that really championed the idea of restorative justice. And then there was a treatise that was written by Reverend Alex G. It was called Justified Anger. And it talked about the disparities in Madison. One of the, per capita, one of the toughest cities in the nation in terms of Black men and being incarcerated. And so there were a number of people that were talking about it. I was working at Marquette University Law School at the time with Professor Geske, and we were working with a professor in Madison, John Shaw. And we got together and we started talking with police officers and social workers and the Department of Human Services at Dane County. And we laid down the groundwork for the restorative justice program. And we traveled to New York, as a matter of fact. And we visited Judge Calabrese in Red Hook. And we visited Brownsville and Harlem and Brooklyn. And we designed our program basically on the model from New York. So we talked about developing a cadre of peacemakers, which are volunteers from all over Dane County. Right now, we've trained over 500 peacemakers. And whenever we sit down in a circle, we have the victim, the respondent, and we have peacemakers that represent the community. So we like to say that we are victim-based, respondent-focused, and community-driven. So the program started in 2014. I was the only paid employee for the first 3 years. I'm happy to say now that we have a full contingent of workers. And we, as Donnetta said earlier, we recently eclipsed working over 1,000 cases with a 91% success rate. And success is defined by completion of repair harm agreements. So once you complete the circle, the sanctions or the agreement, everyone has to agree, from the victim to the respondent, everyone has to agree on the sanction. And that is done to move the system. And when it's completed, all charges are dropped. There's not a CCAP hit, and fines are dropped.
That's great. And I'm going to thank you there. And I'm going to also thank all of our panelists. I know we're pressed for time and many other people have things to do to continue this. I also want to thank all the viewers for joining us. We've heard a lot of tremendous things here today, especially hearing, that we have in Milwaukee County at least some 85% success from restorative justice intervention, and how we've heard from Danielle Sered how putting people back in prisons actually encourages criminogenic behavior, the exact opposite of what the tough on crime crowd and philosophy purports as a solution. So I'm hoping that we can all come together to implement the framework that Danielle discusses and goes into her book, which many of us have mentioned, which you can purchase from boswellbooks.com. We have a lot to think about. We have to roll up our sleeves to begin imagining and creating this better beloved community, which we know can be real, which we have not yet experienced in this country. Thank you for joining us in the second foray into how restorative justice and circle keeping can be implemented. Please join us again next week when we explore impact and possibilities of community circles. We'll be joined by Executive Director Donna Minter and Assistant Executive Director Krajel Shell of the Minnesota Peacebuilding Leadership Institute. They will discuss different ways to engage the community in meaningful anti-violence and racial healing work using community circles. Our panelists that week will also include Pardeep Kaleka, Executive Director of the Zeidler Group Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee, Officer Ralph McLean from Milwaukee Police Department, Program Coordinator and Recruiter, Ann Rasmussen, the Public Service Area Manager for the Milwaukee Public Libraries branches, and Heather Sattler, Milwaukee Public School Teacher at the Alliance School and Restorative Practices Facilitator, Trainer with Restorative Circles, LLC. Thank you to co-moderator, Associate Professor Mike Carrier from MSOE, and to our great volunteers, Molly Collins, Chrissy Fung, Tamika Vukovic, who've been helping moderate our questions. Thank you very much for joining us, my friends. We will share, if you have additional questions, we'll share them with you. If you want to keep in contact or ask questions of any of the panelists, feel free to email me and I'll pass that on at emilio@milwaukeeturners.org. I'll share that at the side. Again, thank you all deeply and very much for helping stimulate this conversation.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.